Okay, there you go, everyone.
How are we doing, everybody? Well, if you have a post-lunch lethargic mood, I certainly guarantee that this panel will wake you up and you won't need even a coffee. So current panel is called Reconstructing the Middle Ages in Popular Media. And our first presenter is Pavel Bychkov, a medievalist and junior researcher of the Department of Historical Anthropology and History of Everyday Life at the Institute of World History in the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Pavel has an MA in history at Russian State University for Humanities. And currently he is working on a PhD dissertation on the subject of political and religious philosophy in late medieval France and England. Bychkov, Pavel Bychkov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introduction. I'll try to share my screen now. I hope everything will be fine. So can you see it? I hope so. Well, as you can see, my theme today is Soviet medievalism in cinema and music of the stagnation period. So what is a stagnation period? It's a specific term to describe Russian history, in a particular period between the removal of Nikita Khrushchev and the death of Chernenko, just before the perestroika started, before the in USSR began the liberalization of political and social life. These 2 decades, between 1964 and 1985, is responsible for the birth of a new culture. It is opposed to official propaganda in coming years of perestroika and Yeltsin Russia. This new culture would be dominant. But this culture was not very homogeneous. It was very mixed up. It was a Western pop culture, political and religious dissidents, modern art, just expression of artists in general. And so the representation of Middle Ages in this culture was also extremely ambivalent, extremely different. So there was Soviet historiography and literature, official Soviet literature that was constructing the Dark Ages myth about oppressive and religiously conservative medieval society with Inquisition and peasantry and so on. But this metaphor sometimes would be turned against the government itself, and so the myth of the Dark Middle Ages was sometimes used to depict the cruel and repressive nature of the government, especially Soviet government, and it would depict not society itself, but a hero, a brave knight, medieval-like scholar sometimes, so someone who is dissident to the regime. Appropriately, I will begin with the movie named The Beginning, Начало in Russian. It was directed by Gleb Panfilov, an independent Russian director, and very famous in the Soviet Union also. Seemingly, it tells the story of an amateur actress and a factory worker, Pasha Stroganova, that you can see on the screen, in a fictional provincial town in Soviet Union. But as the film goes on, another story intercepts the movie itself. It's the trial of Joan of Arc that is shown to us. Later, it is revealed that we are watching the movie that Pasha, the main hero, has a lead role in. She plays there Joan of Arc. So we find out that we're watching 2 movies simultaneously about Middle Ages and modernity. Panfilov depicts the main hero, Pasha, as nowadays Joan of Arc. She is a hero, she is romantic, idealistic, she is seeking for love, she is very lonely, as the Joan of Arc is in this movie in the movie. And Pasha sacrifices herself for her friends and neighbors in everyday activities, in small, unnecessary things, but deep inside, she wants to be a great actress, but nobody believes really in her. Well, the latter, the dream of being an actress would become true, but we can pose the question why the story of Joan of Arc is chosen for the movie in the movie. I believe that this film is existential in its core, maybe existentialistic. We see the last days of Erlen's virgin. She doubts her mission. She is left by her kin. She feels alone. She is sentenced to death. We don't see the triumph, we see just the tragedy. And all of these events echo in the life of Pasha Stroganova. She's in love with Arkady, you can see him on the left. He is played by famous Soviet actor Leonid Kuravlev. But Arkady, her lover, he leaves her at one point. He returns to his family. He has a wife and a daughter. And Pasha struggles with all of these circumstances, such struggle, such tragedy makes her believable Joan of Arc on the screen. The whole story about an actress who's this story of an actress who is an amateur and not considered conventionally beautiful, attractive, but anyway succeeds in her career, constructs the third layer of the movie. So we have the movie in the movie, we have the story of Pasha Stroganova, and another layer of the story, meta-narrative. Because in the beginning of the movie, there are no titles, just a shot of chronologically changing photos of Inna Churikova, as you can see on the screen. Inna Churikova is the actress that plays Pasha in this movie. So we have an interception between the character and the actress who is playing this character. And the biography of Churikova is the source material for the screenplay of this movie. Churikova was an actress in so-called TUS, Young Spectators Theater. It's the lowest level of professional career for Soviet actors. The only role she got in a big project was in Russian fairy tale Morozka, where she plays an antagonist. Similarly, Pasha plays Baba Yaga in the film The Beginning, in this unprofessional theater. Gleb Panfilov met Churikova in this amateur theater and invited her to play the main role in his debut film No Path Through Fire, В огне брода нет, in 1968. And there Churikova depicted a heroic nurse in Russian Civil War. During the process of making this movie and his next movie, The Beginning, which we're discussing, Panfilov married Churikova and dedicated this new film to her and her talent. So he retold in some way her story, her biography. And here you can see the pair, the Churikova and Panfilov. So if originally the story was about an actress playing a heroic female character, why the plot was changed to Joan of Arc? Why Panfilov didn't choose Russian Civil War, like he chose in his first movie, or Second World War? As Panfilov himself stated, the question from the bureaucrats to him was posed, why France and not Russia? Why Joan of Arc and not Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a hero from the World War II? Initially, Panfilov wanted to stage a whole movie about Joan of Arc with Churikova, but the censorship committee decided that it's not appropriate. So he modified the screenplay and kept some elements of this unmade movie. Seemingly, for the bureaucrats, it's a traditional picture in a manner of social realism. So there's a girl from the factory and so on, so on. But in fact, it's deeper than it seems. Soviet philosopher Grigory Pomeranz, who you can see in the upper part of the screen, in his essay The Price of Renunciation in 1981, compared Soviet dissidents to free-thinking heroes of the past, particularly to Giordano Bruno, Tommaso Campanella, and of course Joan of Arc. Pasha Stroganov isn't a dissident, of course. She's just a simple woman, but she's too big for this claustrophobic world for this society of the stagnation period. So she's in some way a Joan of Arc of her era. Besides the existential problems that the movie evokes, it provides some religious symbols. As you may know, religious symbolism was very prohibited in Soviet cinema. For example, there is a scene where Pasha plays Joan of Arc praying to Archangel Michael and other Catholic saints. And let's not forget that Joan of Arc herself is a Catholic saint. Catholicism was an important element of medievalistic imagery for Soviet viewers, for Soviet people, because it was an exotic system of belief associated not with Russia, but with Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Eastern Europe, the near abroad. And it was so associated with other Middle Ages, not ancient Rus, not medieval period in Soviet, in Russian history, but the Western history. So in these countries of near abroad, most of the Soviet fantasy and historical movies were usually staged, especially about the Middle Ages. And so the Catholicism and the Middle Ages and the West was tied up, were the concepts that were all tied up. For example, 1970s popular Yuri Vizbor song, Catholic Church, Yuri Vizbor was a singer-songwriter in the 70s, describes a Catholic woman as tantalizing, completely mysterious, something that evokes some feelings in Soviet men. Surprisingly, this singer-songwriter is also featured in the movie Beginning. He's playing a small role of screenwriter. So the movie The Beginning was a real success for Panfilov and Churikova. The film was nominated to open New York Film Festival in 1971, and the same year Panfilov received a Silver Lion and Churikova a Golden Lion on Venice Film Festival. And Churikova was also named the National Actress of 1970 by Soviet press. It was a triumph because the first Panfilov movie, No Path Through Fire, wasn't shown very widely and wasn't liked by censors and critics in Soviet Union. This idea of reflecting modern-day problems in historical movies in the past was realized in two, from my point of view, program movies that were made at the edge between Khrushchev's thaw and this stagnation period. The first one is Hamlet, made in 1964 by Grigory Kozintsev, an epic screen adaptation of Shakespearean drama. It is considered to be the best movie version, the best screen adaptation by Soviet critics and even by Western critics like Kenneth Branagh. Although it can be doubted that the film tells the story of a dissident, but Shakespearean material provides a wide range of political and social interpretation. And the main hero, played by Innocenty Smutnovsky, can be seen as a dissident figure. Most of the filming of this movie took place in a village in Estonia, as it was mentioned earlier. It's a common practice in Soviet medievalistic cinema to shoot in the Baltic region or in Eastern Europe. The translation that Kozintsev used in his movie was the Russian translation of Shakespeare's drama was made by Boris Pasternak in 1941, the author of a famous novel Dr. Zhivago. As you may already know, the novel was rejected for publication in USSR. It was published in Italy in so-called Tam izdat, so publishing abroad. Pasternak was awarded Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958. He refused to receive it, and in the years previous to making this movie, he was like an unwanted figure. He was heavily criticized in Soviet press. And another talented artist also participated in making this movie. It was Dmitry Shostakovich, who wrote music for Hamlet You can see him on the left. His music was denounced in USSR during the last years of Stalin's life in 1948. The Soviet press wrote it was cacophony instead of music. Of course, the medievalistic imagery in this movie is minimal. There's not much. Most of the scenery is depicted in the 17th century arrangements. The costumes are in the 17th century design. But some of them are medieval, like castle, theater, ghosts of Hamlet's father, as you can see, a threatening figure in this movie. Another interesting detail is that the Kozintsov interpretation of play is accented not on the subjective drama, not on the existential side of this tragedy, but on political courtly aspects of it, on the figure of unjust ruler, on the conflict between the ruler and freethinker. Maybe it is a reflection on political events of this time, mainly Manesh affair in 1962, where Khrushchev critiqued avant-garde artists, and his denunciation of young poets and writers that would end in Sinyavsky Daniel trial in 1966. Sorry. So another program movie, as I see it, is Andrei Rublev, maybe you've heard of it, by Andrei Tarkovsky. And we should mention it if we're talking about dissidents and in Soviet cinema. Also, because Tarkovsky pictures Russian Middle Ages, ancient Rus, that's not the main focus of my paper today, but we should mention it because it's playing a great role in history of Soviet cinema. So every Soviet viewer knew precisely what Tarkovsky intended to say through the biography of this medieval Orthodox painter. It can be proved by reviews of critics, by the memoirs of co-creator of this film, Andrei Konchalovsky, the scenarist, and by the essay of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote about this movie. Rublev was a creative individual who was horrified by brutal reality of his contemporaries, and it's an obvious metaphor for Soviet painters, musicians, writers, poets, and filmmakers of the stagnation period. This picture wasn't really officially released in Soviet Union. The first screening was in 1969, 3 years after the movie was made. Later, it was occasionally shown in some cities across the USSR, always with a full audience in the hall. In conclusion, let's note that all the mentioned before movies were shot in black and white. This marks the chronological distance between the viewer and the action on the screen. So we're shown the past, that's why they're all in black and white. In the end of Andrei Rublev, we see the picture becoming colorized. We are shown the works of this famous painter, and we are transported to the modern days, to the current time. Similarly, Gleb Panfilov in the beginning, Kozintsov in Hamlet, and his next picture, King Lear, and Tarkovsky, they all choose minimalistic color palette. They all choose the same style as Kurosawa, Ingmar Bergman, and other directors that shot their pictures about Middle Ages. On the contrary, in Soviet Union, there existed color cinematography, and it existed not only in Soviet Union, but also in the West. And just like Western medievalistic cinematography, like Ivanhoe, El Cid, and Beckett, was aimed toward the masses to entertain the viewer. In USSR, it was entertaining, but also had an agenda, some ideological meaning to it. Most of this Soviet fiction about Middle Ages was based on Marxist philosophy, on the contradiction between the peasants, the working class, and the oppressors, the evil feudalistic nobles. As you can see, there were even some schemes depicting this oppression in Soviet history books in school that are shown on the right. This scheme can be seen in most of the movies made by major Soviet film studios, but I'll point a couple of them, and one of them is The City of Craftsmen that was made in 1965. It's an outstanding piece of fiction. It's loosely based on a play by Soviet author. The plot is quite simplistic. There was a free medieval city with a market square and a bunch of craftsmen that lived freely, but it was conquered by evil Knight Malicon. You can see him on the left on the poster. The antagonist resembles French King Louis XI a lot. He has spies everywhere, he's ugly, he's old, and he wants to marry the most beautiful woman in the city, Veronica. But there is a brave working man, shown in the middle of the poster, Karakol. He is a craftsman, of course, and he's also a hunchback. He runs in the forests where he and other peasants and craftsmen form partisan movement, and they are all dressed in red, which is not very practical if you want to hide in the woods. And they're fighting injustice, and it's a quite obvious allegory of revolution and civil war and so on. But also in the movie there are some interesting images. For example, shown on the bottom right, there is a painter who is shot with a bow in the beginning of the movie, but he continues his work. He even takes some blood and tries to paint with his blood. It's a very beautiful metaphor as I see it. So there is that implicit symbolism even in such ideologized movie. The whole movie was shot in Tallinn in Estonia, and due to that it had beautiful medieval scenery, the castles, the ruined cathedrals and so on, and had a particular memorized visual style, colorful shots, bright costumes, and as I can see, many modern reviews of those who watched the movies in their childhood in Soviet period of time emphasize on its atmosphere, on its style, and not on the plot. As the main theme of my paper is the connection between cinema and music, I'd like to talk about the score of this film. It was created by proclaimed Soviet composer Oleg Kravchuk, who wrote scores for a couple of cult movie classics, Soviet movies. He even plays a small role in this City of Craftsmen. He is the musician playing the flute in the end. You can see in the middle and the bottom. Kravchuk was quite an extraordinary artist, even extravagant, if I can say so. He always wore glasses in public, dark glasses in public. He liked to perform with a pillowcase on his head, as you can see on the bottom left. He sometimes shouted obscenities from the stage before performing, and had such interesting behavior that his neighbors nicknamed him Mad Composer for this. All his life he was living alone with his mother and didn't have much at his apartment, and he sometimes used his piano as the dinner table or a bed, and didn't have much. To earn for his life, because his own avant-garde compositions weren't welcomed by the Soviet Composers Union, he had to write scores for the movies to provide himself and to have an opportunity to work on his own music that he just composed for himself and nobody else. Later, he would collaborate with some new...
Pavel, I'm sorry. Can I ask you to start your concluding remarks? We are running out of time.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
I thought that we would have much more time. Sorry.
I mean, I'm sorry. It's 20 minutes, so sorry.
Okay. Well, so there's also another movie, To Kill a Dragon, that discusses the relations between the government and the individual, and that poses the questions about the power and the dissident that is opposing that power. The last movie that I would have a couple of words about is Story of Voyages, or Story of Wanderings, by what was made in 1983, it evokes some medievalistic imagery of carnival that was discussed by Mikhail Bakhtin in the 60s and 70s. It pays homage to many medieval and late medieval and Renaissance authors, and even evokes some concepts of microcosmos and celestial man that was popular in the medieval ages. To sum it up, I wanted to show some movies that was made in Soviet period of time, in the period of stagnation, that wasn't leading in the ideological course of Soviet philosophy, so the music and the cinematography tried to imply some their own artistic ideas in the art of this period, to pose important questions about the individual, the state, and the free artistic expressions of a man. So that's all.
Oh, thank you very much, Pavel, for a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure this provokes a number of interesting questions from the audience. And unfortunately, the standard time is 20 minutes, but I'm sure we will compensate this in the Q&A session. So now we move from Soviet Union to Rome. Madeline Stearns, Rome and Oribos, the Eternal Cities. Madeline is presenting her first conference paper, actually, for the Middle Ages as a digital experience. So we have the honor to host her first experience. She completed her bachelor's degree in art history, studio painting, and anthropology in the United States at the University of Northern Colorado in 2018. Wow, that's pretty impressive. Madeline is currently studying art history at John Cabot University in Rome, with expected graduation in December this year. Upon graduation, Madeline plans to have a career as a researcher within the video gaming sector of the entertainment industry. Madeline, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, Madeline, give me a moment. Sorry, yeah. Okay, give it a try there. Please try to unmute yourself and share your screen.
Thank you. And as far as, excuse me, sharing my screen, how do I allow it to do that? I'm so sorry.
So in the bottom part, there is a button, an option that should say share screen. It should allow you to share your screen.
Oh, there it is. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Everything's good?
Yeah, there is. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here today. And today my topic is a little bit less on the social side and a little bit more hard art history, I guess you could say. So this essay is part of an ongoing research project in which I demonstrate how video games use art history as a tool to explain the newest city, Oribos, as a case study. What this conference paper brings to the field of game studies is an art historical approach to World of Warcraft rather than one that is psychological, behavioral, or literary. Since the game's release in 2004, it has been studied mostly by social scientists. Particularly, I'm interested in World of Warcraft's transformational use of real-world arts and architecture to suit new fantasy contexts, specifically through their forms and functions. For example, when a real-world piece of art or architecture is appropriated into a fantasy video game, how far removed from their original context do these imitations have to be to retain their function and meaning? There are many objects I'm interested in studying through their representation in video games, but for now I will focus on one architectural monument as a case study, the city of Oribos. In this paper, I'll be identifying the forms and functions of the foremost salient features of the city, its architectural plan, the quincunx emblem, the geographical location of the city within the Shadowlands, and the pavements. By looking at the real art historical origins of each of these features, it is possible to better understand the use and function of the entire space in the World of Warcraft and its lore. I would like to start with some brief background information about the game for those who may not be intimately familiar with it. World of Warcraft, often referred to casually as WoW, is a monthly subscription-based video game that emerged in 2004 by the US company Blizzard. World of Warcraft is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, that allows players to interact simultaneously to complete objectives. World of Warcraft has seen 8 expansions, with Shadowlands being the most recent, released in November of 2020, and a 9th that was just announced yesterday, very exciting. The expansions add to the game's breadth with new maps and storylines approximately every 2 to 3 years of real time. The created history of the game, or the lore, is understood to have approximately 20,000 years of history. What's all that history without some monuments and architecture to go with it, right? There are many fictional cultures that are present in the game, each with their own particular linguistic, religious, and material traits. These cultures are often region-specific, and in a Vitruvian sense, the architecture of major cities are largely defined by the lifestyles of these inhabitants. Fantasy video game cultures like these are often teetering between otherworldliness and familiarity. They are created by a combination of division and or fusion of materials and storylines from real-world cultures across time, not only medieval ones. The design of Oribos is therefore also defined by the culture and location of the Shadowlands. Oribos is the latest social and economic hub of World of Warcraft. When the player first enters Oribos, they are informed that this is the Eternal City. Oribos has a strict circular floor plan with 2 main levels and a hollow core that is flooded with wind-like bursts of light. The city itself is not rooted on any soil, and it is a floating capsule-like structure with high vaulted ceilings. The space has a very serene and resolute color palette throughout of blue-gray, copper, and light blue accents. The primary level, called the Ring of Fates, has 3 radiating sections, 2 on the inside and 1 outer ring that is uncovered, with a 360-degree view of the gates that lead to the 4 peripheral realms of the Shadowlands, indicated by their color. It is explained to the players that this is an ancient city made by the mysterious First Ones, but the ornamentation comes from the Middle Ages of our reality. Oribos, as I've said, is described as an ancient city of the afterlife. Rome, too, is a city most famous for its ancient origins and celebrates her 2,775th birthday this week, as of yesterday, actually. Rome is more than ancient. It witnessed the collapse of Western imperial paganism and the rise of Christianity. With this change came new need for architectural formats, procedures, and iconographies. One such invention was the martyrium, or pilgrimage mausoleum. The most representative example from the early Middle Ages is Santa Costanza in Rome. Grand mausoleums are a Roman tradition, but the need to accommodate for pilgrims was new with Christianity, and so spaces such as ambulatories were devised. That would be this kind of middle section here with these little pockets. As we can see, the layout of Oribos also contains an ambulatory and exterior walk space. Ambulatories are for visiting pilgrims who want to observe relics. While there may not be any relics to speak of in Oribos, spoiler alert, they are elsewhere in Shadowlands, it is also a place for pilgrims. Observe this conversation that occurs passively between two NPCs or non-playable characters that chat with each other intermittently. I was unable to capture it live, I apologize, but it goes something like this. Emissary Basolo says, "Thank you for allowing me to accompany you on this pilgrimage, Opulence. The Eternal City is wondrous indeed." To which Opulence replies, "It is impressive, Basolo, but it pales in comparison to the other works of the first ones." Emissary Basolo says, you have seen their handiwork, the patterns, the geometry?" And Opulence says, "That is for me to know. I will speak no further of it here." It's rather cryptic. This conversation was created by the developers of the game, and it confirms the function of the space to align with its real-world derived architectural form as a martyrium or pilgrimage mausoleum. Oribos is an officially neutral sanctuary where players of both rivaling factions can mingle, but they are not allowed to engage in combat against one another, further emphasizing the use of the pilgrimage mausoleum as a sacred space. The name of the city probably comes from the Latin origin of the word for orb being orbis, which means ring, but there are also a handful of Ouroboros emblems in the city that might also contribute to this name. I will say though that these snake and Ouroboros images are not very consistent, and they're found in very few places compared to other imagery such as the quincunx. The quincunx is a motif that makes itself known on practically every kind of surface in Oribos. A quincunx can generally consist of any 5 things, arranged with 4 on the outside and 1 in the middle that are connected to each other. Historically, the quincunx is also used in Rome, but generally it's used as a compositional aid for various forms of media, whether it's a mosaic, fresco, book illustration, or any other kind of surface that can be decorated, really. Quincunxes can be arranged either diagonally or upright. Also located at the Martyrium of Santa Costanza are the vault mosaics with interlacing quincunxal borders connecting various images to one another chronologically or conceptually. As I have said, quincunxes appear in many places as in Oribos, such as wagons, furnishings, above doorways, and on personal objects such as belts and weapons. All, if not nearly all, of these quincunxes are in the upright position and have circular frames around them. They are filled with what appears to be blue spherical glass or gemstone. This specific design imitates the medieval tradition of polychrome adornment, in which precious gems, enamels, and colored glass are faceted onto the surfaces of objects, such as the bindings of highly venerated books, ceremonial garments, and of course, saintly relics. In Christian art, this design is associated with the Holy Cross, and thus resulted in a kind of medieval quincunx mania. If it's a medical condition, I'm currently suffering from it myself. This tradition's origins can also be connected to Rome, when Pope Pascal I brought the remains of over 2,000 martyrs into the city, and the cult of the saints became urban canonical practice in the 9th century. While the quincunx on various objects in Oribos appears to be casually decorative, it may in fact serve a more political function in the game. And this is because the entire map of the Shadowlands is also a quincunx, with Oribos at the center, connected by flight to the other 4 major outlying realms of Bastion, Maldraxxus, Ardenweald, and Revendreth. The quincunx emblem therefore functions as a model for the 4 primary potential destinations of a departed soul. When a soul first reaches the Shadowlands, it is sent to be judged by a deity called the Arbiter, and then it is sent to one of the 4 destinations to fulfill its purpose. These 4 realms are politically in allegiance with Oribos, with the heads of each government under service of the Arbiter. There is a 5th destination, as we can see on the map in the lower left, called the Maw, but it has been omitted plot-wise, sorry, low-key spoiler, because the leader of the Maw betrayed the Arbiter and has been exiled. On the player's map of the Shadowlands, the Maw appears in the upper left. However, it is probably, geographically speaking, directly below the city center of Oribos, due to the fact that in order for players to get to the Maw, players must jump into the oculus of the city, and they land onto its surface with great impact. As mentioned previously, to travel between these peripheral realms of the Shadowlands, players must connect through Oribos first, in the same way that the interlacing of a quincunx connects to the center before it connects to any of the other items around the outside. It is not possible, for example, to fly directly from Revendreth to Bastion without going through the middle. A quincunx then here is a political icon of the city that emphasizes its importance both in geographical location and political role within the Shadowlands. The most intriguing quincunx, in my opinion, of all the Shadowlands are those that compose the floor patterns of the city. Although the city of Oribos is referred to as ancient, the pavements are derived from a uniquely medieval craft. During the Middle Ages, the method of crafting quincunxes and floors shifted from using small, uniformly sized mosaic tiles called opus tessellatum to larger and more precisely cut and fitted stone slabs, opus sectile. The quincunx floors of Oribos are clearly not mosaics, instead they are the opus sectile type. Opus sectile arts, in reality, can be found on vertical surfaces and stone furnishings, such as canopies, altars, and pulpits. The vast majority for these arts are located in Italy, and many of which are in Rome. This means that the floors of Oribos were inspired by pavements made after the decline of Western Rome and are specific to the Middle Ages. All of the individual parts of these floors are made from the spolia tradition of looting ancient Roman spaces for their precious stone finishings. Columns could be cut down into slices or pucks to make these rotae, while other shapes could be portioned from the rectangular sheets that veneered walls. There are 183 pavements with quincunxal opus sectile styles in Rome and its immediate vicinity, with all of these having been made between the 12th and 13th centuries by a specific group of marble masons called the Cosmati. These works made by the Cosmati are subsequently called cosmatesque art. Italy hosts 98.5 of all known cosmatesque art. Interestingly, despite the name, these works do not depict the cosmos. I would argue that this example is very planetary, but that's not the point. There have been a few attempts made by scholars to prescribe this meaning onto these designs, but there is no supporting evidence. As we know, the depiction of the cosmos was absolutely present in medieval art, although mostly through manuscripts. Opus sectile floors that do depict the cosmos and include the zodiac are more complex and very dissimilar, mostly because the division of 12 zodiac figures can't be divided into 5. The math just doesn't work there. And mostly this design is probably to emulate the need for Christian spaces to depict the Holy Cross. And this kind of functions as both an upright and diagonal. It's a dicussate kind of cross. However, here, through the use of cosmatesque pavements and the quincunxal arrangement of the realms of the Shadowlands, Blizzard seems to have pulled this medieval misconception into their fantasy world as if to say, but what if it did represent the cosmos? Which I think is quite cool. One unique characteristic of the design choices made for the city of Oribos is that much of the material perceived as stone is of a singular darker color. This is not characteristic of the pavements of Rome, any of them actually. All the examples of cosmatesque flooring are largely composed of white marbles. Oribos is the heart of a fantasy afterlife. The developers made Oribos not as the gleaming city of a Christian heaven on earth that more closely follows our real world examples, but rather a solemn and contemplative one that suits its architectural mausoleum format and mysterious architects, the first ones. It should be mentioned that there is perhaps a more practical nature of the floor choice for Oribos that needs to be taken into consideration. The opus sectile pavements of medieval Rome are famous for their intricacies and micropatterns. I argue that these elements, which are signatures of opus sectile floors, could not be incorporated into the opus sectile floors of Oribos for technical reasons. There are several locations in World of Warcraft that do indulge in extravagance and complex surface textures. However, these locations, due to their nature, are restricted to 25 players at a time. Depicting high-resolution surfaces places high demand on personal computers, and it can lead to exhaustion. In order for the computer to attempt to depict graphics in high resolution, game performance is often sacrificed. In other words, low frame rate, lag, and any gamers in the audience know that if you start to experience lag in a high population area of an MMO, one quick fix is to adjust your game's graphic settings to decrease the texture, detail, or quality. And the result is usually a return to a more pleasant and seamless frame rate that enhances movement. The massively multiplayer aspect of the game therefore required some problem solving when the developers wanted a space to be visually accessible. In 2021, World of Warcraft was estimated to be visited by over 1 million players daily, divided among 556 servers worldwide. It is thus likely that the environment developers, knowing that Oribos would become a city with high player traffic as the latest hub, would need to have inherently less complex textures on surfaces such as the floors where it could be sacrificed in order to give players a more enjoyable experience. Here is an example in which I have taken a screenshot with both low settings and high settings, and you can note some of the texture differences, but that the floors themselves actually remain mostly unchanged. This is called fixed load balancing. Blizzard most likely uses a newer method called dynamic load balancing to manage its server populations. And so preemptively altering the environment to compensate for latency issues is not necessary, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And so the design of the floors here can be directly correlated to both the real world art historical form that inspired them and the anticipated function of the space by players. In order for this motif to function in the technical limits of the space as well, the pavements found new life through simplicity and a monochrome color scheme. Form follows function in the gaming world as it does in the tangible art world as well. It is perhaps not a coincidence that both Oribos and Rome are titled the Eternal City. Rome, the city with the highest concentration of opus sectile quincuncial pavements, home of the pilgrimage mausoleum and the cult of the saints. Oribos emulates each of these medieval material cultural elements in its own way. Rather, World of Warcraft's team of creators have intentionally looked to Rome's medieval arts as the inspiration for Oribos. Blizzard did not invent the parts of the whole to design their city, and yet they have been reinvented. The combination of these things in otherworldly fantasy context is new. Here, World of Warcraft utilized art history as a tool to define its own fantasy world while keeping player experience in mind. The uniqueness of its icons, overall design, and function is what makes the city of Oribos one of a kind as a digital space that is completely connected in its appearance, materials, icons, and use simultaneously. Here is my selected bibliography and my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this exciting presentation, Madeline. I'm sure there will be follow-up questions in Q&A. And our last but not least speaker, Ben Reda. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yep, that's correct.
Yay! So Ben Reda is a historian and currently a PhD candidate at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, as well as a current member of the organization Association for Visual Pedagogies. He specializes in the field of historical game studies with a particular interest on games set in the medieval period and East Asian history. A major focus in his current doctoral dissertation is investigating the medium of historical games, gameplay, particularly its key model engagements for and expressions of knowledge from communicating and experiencing history, and examines two historical games set in the Middle Ages, namely Kingdom Come, Deliverance, and A Plague Tale: Innocence.
Awesome.
Floor is yours.
Awesome. I'll just share my screen. Can anyone just see just the screen without the notes? If it's, but is it, does the screen has any notes in it or not?
Give us a moment because it is loading.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
It's all
there it
good.
is. Perfect. Thank you.
No notes on it.
Yeah, it looks fine without notes, just the presentation.
Sorry. Yep, cool. All right. Sorry, there was yeah, it just seems the interconnection's a bit lagging on my end. Sorry. Okay, that's all good. Sorry. Okay. Kia ora, good evening. My name is Ben, and today I'll be presenting myself and my colleague Gareth's paper that will introduce some of the recent endeavors and activities within medieval gaming pertaining to new advancements of scholarship dissemination. To signify and elaborate on some of these constructions and experiences of medieval scholarship by introducing a newly emergent modality of gameplay representation called lore history. And finally, to illustrate lore history and its inner workings and its provision of scholarly medieval history via one of the doctoral case studies, Kingdom Come Deliverance, developed by Warhol Studios in Prague, using as evidence a series of screenshot images from several of the many sequences of Kingdom Come Deliverance's game footage that I recorded during doctoral research with supporting historical literature, fieldwork photography, and interviews I conducted with several games designers from Warhol Studios, including their employed historian, Johanna Novak. The Middle Ages continues to be one of, if not the most popular genre of digital games. The growing popularity of these medieval game releases is attributed in part to the innate versatility of the medieval period as a viable source for providing a range of settings and experiences compatible to a wide range of game systems. Whether those experiences are besieging castles and a buffet of intensive medieval combative fights and battles, opting for a safer and less violent medieval life by living and foraging at your newly built medieval homestead as a rural peasant, or even role-playing characters from your favorite medieval game by cosplaying, the Middle Ages and the pastime and sundries of medievalism continues to transpose into public discourse in online media. But while studies have well documented the gamic treatments of the medieval period as a lucrative source for player entertainment in both its historical and fantastical forms, a prevalent question arises. Can medieval games, beyond being a source of media entertainment for its players, possess the capacity to operate not as purely supporting tools or resources for teaching history and its practices, but as animative histories offering critical scholarship and accounts on the Middle Ages? I do not mean medieval historical games designed and published by academic scholars or institutions in order to be academic or scholarly, but rather medieval games exhibiting historical representations or experiences that contain or express digital variations of scholarship. Currently within historical game studies, the main consensus among a number of video game historians and digital game scholars such as Adam Chapman, Jeremiah McCaw, and Andrew Elliott is that while historical games have different representation styles, they cannot offer the same kinds of textual analysis, scholarship, and productions of knowledge and historical accounts found in conventional academic history. Instead, these games are best understood and ideally suited as either models or resources for teaching the tools in the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge and discourse within a formalist framework. To clarify, historical game classes models entail, for example, their ability to offer digital ludic heritage and reenactment experiences with the spatial and temporal dynamics of historical buildings and artifacts, offering players agency and offering counterfactual history through their ludonarratives, and generate system-based models that play on or experiment with history as a process through mastery of the game system and its rules, including simulations of historical conditions, concepts and theories such as causality and contingency, and in respect to medieval history, the systems of feudalism and warfare. This area within historical game study is still relevant and valuable. However, we perceive this area only accounts for some of the many wide plethora of engagements, distinctive experiences, and research avenues which in recent years have begun to constitute and extend historical games, not as simply tools or ludic models, but as multi-communicative histories containing and diversifying its particular modes, research and analytical methods, and incentives of scholarship expression. Therefore, we forward the argument that historical games, particularly forthcoming releases and those released in the last several years, are becoming fully fledged animative gameplay histories, contributing a wide range of exciting, valuable scholarship that are on par with and often draw from, but are not imitations of historical scholarship found in literary academic history. This framework of examining historical games as histories encompasses and is undertaken by shifting to multimodal gameplay as the actual medium of representing the past, and subsequently the primary source of accumulating and disseminating scholarship through recording and analyzing game footage, as its multimodal composition is what drives the entire animative experience and player interactivity with the intricacies of the game world via its simultaneous integration and interaction between its multiple literacies and modes of communication, including in simultaneity its ludic and procedural elements such as rules and game mechanics, but also the visual, performative, narrative, verbal, oral, and many other communicative modes and styles. Under a multimodality lens or focus, we can uncover that representation through gameplay provides a wider variety of experiential scholarship by exhibiting different types or modalities of historical expression, agency, and experience, ranging from the imaginative, folkloric, and fantastical to digital productions of research and evidence-intensive localized histories on par with academic accounts. However, examining gameplay history still requires us to understand and approach them as both representational texts and ludic outputs of the game's procedural system, as a game's representation cannot exist without the procedural components and affordances involved. Medieval historical games are currently at the forefront of this venture in designing and communicating scholarly gameplay histories and their modes of research and game design. We see this, for example, in advancements of historical practices among recent medieval game releases, such as Total War 3 Kingdoms and Kingdom Come Deliverance, demonstrating not only historical research and game design methods derived from academic history, such as accessing and integrating older primary and secondary historical sources, but also creating new methods or engagements specifically dedicated or appropriated to doing historical research for a game. Examples include the transmission of documented histories from academia into story quests or activities, using mocap technology and expert medieval martial artists as stunt actors for capturing the choreography, coordinations, and fluidity of human movement of medieval combat, and translating the known or documented personalities and characteristics of real-life figures into unique game mechanics or the dynastic factions that the player can choose from. Gameplay scholarship has also been heavily developed in the realm of folklore and past imaginative works, wherein various worlds, stories, subject matter, and aesthetics from old folk tales and legends, mythology, religion, visual art, and literary and dramatic works are renewed under new guises for retelling or remediating the game's respective history in a playfully imaginative or fantasy tone, while still containing traces of sociocultural, folkloric, and poetic literacies about the past. And finally, gameplay scholarship has also been instrumental as a centerpiece for online content creators to develop and narrate lore video and/or podcast channels dedicated to their expertise on the lore on the constructed medieval universes or worlds of their favorite video game, such as videos by Vati Vidya on the Soul series, detailing the historical background and tragic downfall of a particular enemy boss or ally companion that you eventually encounter and fight against. In summary, we can confine the construction and dissemination of medieval scholarship through interactive experiential gameplay, such as those aforementioned, to a handful of major modalities of historical gameplay representation, which are alternate history.
Ben, I'm sorry, just interrupt you just a moment, because we're still just looking to your first slide. Maybe have you been moving it and we're not there?
Oh, no, I've been flicking through.
Yeah, it did give me the impression. Yeah, we were just looking like at your.
Oh, sorry. There must have been a cutout at the start. That's why. Oh, I'm terribly sorry.
No, don't worry about it. So maybe why don't you try on sharing your screen and share it again? Maybe that way.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, there was a bit of a sort of a hiccup when. Hang on a minute. Sorry.
I mean, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I'll go from here. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is. I'll share my PowerPoint with anyone, so it's all good. Hang on. Yeah, there's been a cutout, sorry. For some reason, it won't let me, hang on. I don't know why it's not letting me share. Hang on, I'll just stop sharing, sorry.
Don't worry.
Hang on. Can you see a blank?
Give it a moment because it's loading. Give it a moment.
On my end.
Try it again. Give me, yeah. Try sharing your screen again. You're muted. You muted your. There.
Sorry, yeah, it did like another freeze up. So I'm wondering whether that's been causing the my PowerPoint to.
Maybe if you just open PowerPoint without the slideshow and you can just move the screen, the slides like that, maybe that way would
Okay.
work.
All right, I'll give that a try. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Sorry about this.
No. Please continue.
All right. In summary, we can confine the construction and dissemination of medieval scholarship through interactive experiential gameplay, such as those aforementioned, to a handful of major modalities of historical gameplay representation, which are alternate history, imaginative history, and finally, lore history, with the last two modalities being my own coined or invented terms for my doctoral thesis. However, for this presentation, I'll be focusing on lore history as the latest and emergent form of historical gameplay currently developed in certain recent games of the medieval period. To provide an exhaustive yet clear definition of this modality, lore history represents only one of a handful of bodies of lore expression within gaming, alongside other forms such as folklore embodying games, Neo and A Plague Tale Innocence, which I did show in the earlier slide, but you might not have seen it. Hence, my usage of lore history is founded on an amalgamation of the meanings under the wider term lore within both the disciplines of history and in digital game design, with three of the major meanings or functions discussed here, that of lore as knowledge, as world building, and experience. I partially define lore along history lines as knowledge that is fundamentally as a compendium of all the known knowledge about events, subjects, traditions, and trends that took place or existed in the past. And equally important as a scholar's methodology of establishing or reconstructing the knowledge of that history via extensive historical research, cross-examination of sources, and subsequently as assemblage and ordering of facts into a coherent narrative. Lore as world building, in summary, represents an extensive body of knowledge about the entirety of the game's world or universe and its various minutiae, as well as providing or creating a backstory to the game's settings, characters, and its narratives. Finally, another vital yet often overlooked aspect of lore embedded within gaming is lore as an experiential form of learning by accumulating and contributing immediate knowledge through the player's interactivity, analysis, and erudition of the game's world, various minutiae, events, and settings. When combined with its world-building function, lore's experience encompasses a multitude of situations, such as gaining information or knowledge on a subject from dialogue conversations with various characters, solving storylines or incidents and conflicts entrenched in extensive historical backgrounds, and either reading written texts about or encountering physical evidence and traces of past major events and conflicts. From a historical game context, this manifestation of lore then permeates and historicizes the various components and mechanisms of the game's procedural system, including environmental storytelling, audiovisual design, and game mechanics. However, due to the varied multimodal nature and breadth of knowledge operating in historical games in both its world-building and experiential functions, I offer lore history and its main body of units, historical lore, as a more active, animative construct of and method for acquiring historical knowledge. This is because lore in historical games is not simply synonymous to knowledge itself and recounting descriptions of factual details, but is instead a vast overarching body or tradition of all the various types of knowledge and the varying semiotic modes of knowledge expression within gameplay. I define lore history then, not merely as the content or substance, but also more importantly, as the historical modality involving the discovery, dissemination, and experience of either or both new and extended interpretations of existing historical knowledge and insights in relation to the game's chosen history, presented as an experience through gameplay historical lore. Because of lore history's integrative nature, historical games pertaining to this modality are explicitly able to interweave and communicate in simultaneity a wide range of histories as animative and interconnected experiences and events, ranging from politics and military battles and warfare to the everyday lives, occupations of, and conflicts among members from the different echelons of society, and by extension, representations of women and Indigenous agency. This capacity is grounded on these games' emphasis on a more intensive use of historical methods in both research and game design that, in paraphrasing historian Dawn Spring's words, primarily center history informing environments, narratives, gameplay mechanics, and strategies, as well as how original primary source research can become those elements. Thus, games embodying law history function to go beyond factual proximity to known or accepted evidence, as well as showing how the past appeared to those living in that time. They also actively incorporate spaces and activities that experientially generate and disseminate new historical knowledge and insights about the past as animative gameplay scholarship. So as an introductory platform into further illuminating and illustrating the significance of law history for future studies into medieval gaming, I would like to use one of my doctoral case studies, Kingdom Come Deliverance, or KCD, as the earliest and currently the most prominent example of representing medieval history through a law history mode. KCD is a localized critical gamut rendition of the Ratai-Sasau region and its predicaments in late medieval Bohemia, which is now today Czech Republic, during a major civil war from 1402 to 1403. The conflict was between two brothers and rivals, King Sigismund of Hungary and his older brother, King Wenceslaus, the ruler of Bohemia. The game's character Henry, a son of a blacksmith and later a knight, is an emblematic representation of the everyday people and communities during this historical conflict. The game then is an exemplar of engaging primarily in the modality of law history by its experiential gameplay sequences exhibiting integrations with an advancement of scholarship about either the Ratai-Sasau region during the Civil War or phenomena, trends, and activities that, while fictional, are reconstructive of or prevalent in late medieval Bohemia before and during the Civil War. Sources of law histories within this game include late medieval Bohemia, late medieval combat in the German tradition, the agencies, occupations, and/or predicaments of certain medieval Bohemian women, and discussions about theologian Jan Hus's recent sermon in Prague, while debating religious morality and the corruption of the Catholic Church with a drunken, gambling, and womanizing village priest, Father Godwin, at the inn in the village of Ujits. As much as I like to go on of all these law histories for 10 hours, today I just want to demonstrate some of the gameplay possibilities of KCD's scholarly engagements with law history through Henry's experience of the real-life horrific siege of Silver Skalitz, or in Czech, Srebrna Skalica. The siege of Silver Skalitz is one of the few events known to have occurred during the Civil War. In KCD, the siege serves as a prelude to the main storyline, as Silver Skalitz is Henry's hometown and where his adventure begins. The dates and outcome of the siege and the respective leading commanders during the siege, included as factual reconstructions in KCD's version, are documented in the footnotes of published written histories of the region. Secondary and primary sources shown here, one Czech, the other Hungarian, document that on March the 23rd, 1403, King Sigismund's army besieged and razed the entire castle town of Silver Skalitz, which is at the time governed by one of Wenceslaus's allies, Sir Radzi Kobila. On the night when the castle was surrounded, Radzik escaped to and found refuge in another town called Ratai, which consequently led to Sigismund razing most of Silver Skalitz to the ground, including its castle. Warhol Studios historian Johanna Novak also researched the town's reputation for the mining and exporting of silver to the Bohemian crown, which provided a convincing motivation for the attack as represented in the game. However, while both the siege and its outcome were real events, current written histories, such as those shown on the slide, contain only glimpses or vague details. They do not tell us how many people died, the manner and extent of the violence and destruction, or Sigismund's reasons or objectives aside from obtaining a local source of silver. This limited historical detail about the event, and especially its impact on the local communities adjacent to nearby Silver Skalitz, is compounded by scant archaeological evidence. Behind the houses in the image on the left, taken during my fieldwork, is roughly the spot where the town's castle once stood on a hill. With Sigismund's destruction of the building after the siege, the only apparent remains are some of the castle's base foundations. The sole intact structure that remains from the period is a small chapel in the once existing village commune of Rovinia, about 10 minutes walk from Silver Skalitz, which was built in the mid-14th century and which can be visited by the player in the game. KCD connects the siege to the wider ongoing Bohemian Civil War between Sigismund and Wenceslaus by being an experiential gameplay reconstruction, representing it as a site of a localized military massacre and plunder, rather than an epic or heroic medieval battle. Thus, the game's historical rendition of this event focused on the brutality inflicted upon the hundreds of unnamed innocent townsfolk of Silver Skalitz, whose chances of survival were unlikely. This depiction was built on Warhol Studios' comparative research on the siege of Kutná Hora, which was led by Sigismund in late 1402 at the beginning of the Civil War, including a site visit to the town and its silver mine museum. As a much larger and more populous settlement, Sigismund's army besieged and sacked Kutna-Hora for its silver in order to pay for his army, and because the settlement resisted Sigismund's claims to the throne and supported his brother Wenceslaus. The gameplay format allowed Warhorse Studios to create a scholarly experiential reconstruction of the siege of Silver Skeleton on the medieval settlement's last day of existence, with Henry one of many victims of Sigismund's siege attack, by breaking it down into 3 narrative quests entitled Unexpected Visit, Run, and Homecoming. To begin this lore history, as Henry on March the 23rd, 1403, I was given some errands to do for my adopted blacksmith father Martin, such as picking up an emblematic crossguard for a sword and collecting an unpaid debt from a villager named Kunesh. After completing the errands and returning to help Martin finish the final touches to his new sword for the town's lord and overseer, Sir Radzik, an army in the distance arrived unexpectedly outside Silver Skeleton. This hostile army was revealed to be under the command of King Sigismund, comprising of mercenary nomadic human soldiers as the vanguard, with numerous ranks of Czech and possibly Hungarian soldiers belonging to Sigismund and his Czech allies, respectively. Within moments, the soldiers fired flaming arrows upon the villages and buildings, setting the town ablaze while the Cuman vanguard broke through the town's front wooden gate. Shortly afterwards, a chaotic array of violence through cinematic cutscenes that depicted the slaughter of garrison soldiers and showed terrified and unarmed residents trying to flee the town or seeking safety in the castle before the drawbridge closed. Henry's parents were also killed, and as Skalitz's castle drawbridge was closed, one of the guards tells Henry to escape and head to nearby Tomberg. With no other option, I ran from the settlement's back entranceway and found a horse, while being chased by missile fire from several Cuman horse archers. I then witnessed further horrific scenes of pillaging and violence committed by the Cumans on the outskirts of Silver Skeleton and at the village of Ravenna during my escape, including those who were trying to seek safety in Ravenna's small church, but were butchered by Cumans. And evidence of these acts of massacre violence continued when I returned the following day in order to find and bury my parents. Arriving at the village of Ravenna, for instance, I discovered the burnt remains of the village and its church and an array of mutilated and burnt bodies, both human and animal, either scattered or gathered in large piles around the vicinity. These scenes were a recurring phenomenon the further I journeyed back to Silver Skeleton, which culminated into both the town and its castle completely razed to the ground and filled with dead bodies. These experiential gameplay accounts constitute as a lore history containing new scholarly historical knowledge from KCD that expand on the nature of the Bohemian Civil War. Principally, this gameplay lore history taught me that Sigismund used brutal attrition, besieging and sacking settlements in tandem with committing military-directed massacres in order to swiftly end the war by disempowerment of his brother Wenceslaus's allies, as well as to discourage the native populace from active combat by committing localized or regional mass killings. While these gameplay sources of historical knowledge were not found directly in the primary and secondary sources that I accessed, they were corroborated with the help of Warhorse Studios' early research and fieldwork on the early discussed siege of Kutna-Hora in 1402 by identifying similarities shared between the two settlements. Namely, both were major silver mining facilities directly owned by the king, which would ideally be suited for Sigismund as spoils for plunder, as well as a temporary means to pay for his large army. As settlements that rebelled against Sigismund due to being governed by allies or supporters of King Wenceslaus, and being relatively near not only to each other, but also to the capital city of Prague. Furthermore, the game highlighted other sources of knowledge, including that the Ravenna village and its church were another site of massacre by Sigismund's army, as well as the presence of the Cuman vanguard as the initial participants in the killing and pillaging, alongside, albeit briefly, the Czech soldiers accompanying Sigismund in his campaign. In the former, the game's expansion of the participation of the initial violent killings committed by the Cumans is grounded on the few brief footnotes detailing Cumans present in Sigismund's campaign into Bohemia and their warlike nature, with one written source being historian Peter Kornez's Great History of the Czech Crown, Volume 5. In the latter, it is likely that a large subset of allied Czech soldiers serving Sigismund would have belonged to at least some of his Czech allies and benefactors who historically supported his campaign, such as Otto III of Burgau, an important character discussed near the very end of the game. Overall, therefore, this particular source of medieval lore history within KCD challenges current medieval consensus by historians such as Lawrence Marvin and Christopher Alman that military massacres were mostly activities committed or acted on by solely invading foreign armies against border towns and cities, and instead indicate soldiers and noblemen native to their invaded home country as other active participants in localized military massacres. So to conclude this presentation, lore history comprises only one type of lore representation and gameplay scholarship, but its communication of the past through integrating historical lore of a game's respective history into scholarly animative experiences heralds a new trend of medieval gaming, wherein medieval games can undertake a more scholarly pursuit in form of historical immersion, particularly in using relatively unknown or minimally documented local events. While lore history and its applications in both game design and gameplay representation are still in their infancy, its potential for expansion and its use by scholars in future studies has been encouraged with Warhol Studios' current development of a forthcoming sequel to Kingdom Come Deliverance. Likewise, certain upcoming releases like Manor Lords and Noble's Life Kingdom Reborn offers potential candidacy for representing the Middle Ages primarily through the medium of lore history in a real-time strategy context. These potential games, in tandem with Warhol Studios' sequel, may instill or inspire upcoming game studios to undertake a similar attempt in future medieval projects. And I've finished my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben Reda. Now we are on to Q&A session. I may actually use my privilege as the moderator to steer the conversation. My question is to, which one to pick? Pavel. Thank you again, Pavel. So my question will be revolving around the two terms that intrigue my attention. One is censorship, the other is canon. So I wonder whether patterns could surface from your study regarding the predictability of these patterns behind censorship and canon, and is there any interplay between the cinemas that are espoused as part of a canon or declined as part of censorship, whether there's an interplay with that along with historiography that the Soviet government is willing to sponsor when it comes to the periodization of history. Yeah, basically.
So there's, answering the first question about the canons, there is no particular patterns in this canon. So something that can be viewed as not so ideologically pure could be banned, could be prohibited, because the independent authors, the independent artists, developed a whole language of saying something metaphorically, saying something not directly, and every element that didn't fit in this quite simplistic picture would be viewed as not welcome by the censorship. And sorry, I didn't quite catch about the historiography. So was Soviet historiography sponsored by the government or not? No?
I meant whether one can catch any interplay when it comes to interplay between the historiography and the cinema / music. You know, when it comes to these patterns of if there are any. But for canon, you said that it's not really the pattern, it's beyond pattern, but when it comes to, let's say in this case, censorship, and whether one can historicize that, actually historicize the patterns of censorship, and if so, in what context can this emerge? Because you lay out like a very thorough survey to us, but to me, then the next question is how to contextualize that, and the key words that come to my mind while listening to you is state control, basically. So I would love to hear your ideas on that when it comes to, and this is one of the suggestions as a listener, you know, one of the suggestions to contextualize your work.
Maybe if I may, because I have a question also for Pavel that goes kind of in the same line. Maybe if I can elaborate, so we have one single question, because something that also caught my attention very strongly is this idea that you mentioned between Middle Ages and dissidence, right? In the end, art serves as a tool of dissidence, which is contextualized within a political system. And what that brought to mind is precisely something that you mentioned about the representation of the Catholic Church. And I wanted to ask, precisely within this changing context of the history of the second half of the 20th century in the Soviet Union, how could one compare the representation, for example, of the Catholic Church and of the Orthodox Church in these type of productions? Because I haven't seen a lot of these movies, but I, for example, remember seeing Alexander Nevsky. And Alexander Nevsky is very interesting because the religious Orthodox character, the monk, is a traitor who joins with the Teutonic Knights. Actually, I don't remember it fully, but the only Orthodox religious character is still a very evil character, which again, then would link to my question, how are these portrayed in later moments that you were talking about in your presentation, and how to relate that with how actually the Soviet government is trying to portray or understands the period?
Yes, it's a very good point that that the religious imagery would not appear in major Soviet movies like Alexander Nevsky. For example, they didn't show the crosses or something like that you would expect from this period. So yes, traditionally religious imagery would be a bad thing. For example, the other movie, Robin Hood's Arrow, there are canonically antagonists. It's a duke and a sheriff and archbishop that opposes Robin Hood and his brave fighters, who symbolize like something like peasantry, rebels, and something good in this Marxist scheme, a very primitive Marxist scheme. And so if someone showed some religious imagery, that would be read by the viewers as something related to opposing the official position against the church. And even in screen adaptations of classic novels, for example, Dostoevsky and other, that would be viewed as something not quite ideologically pure. Concerning the Soviet historiography, of course, there were some authors that weren't that weren't that accepted in the Soviet historiography. For example, Gurevich is the main, I think, dissident from the historians themselves. He would try to apply this Marxist scheme to his researches, but it wouldn't work. So he would pose the question if these schemes are even necessary, and that would provoke a discussion and even some actions against him as a scientist. So these themes, I think, there were some major authors who would later live on in the historiography, like Gurevich, Bakhtin, and others, and they wouldn't be fit in this simplistic schemes that others just repeated from book to book. And there would be like all other historiography that would just fade away within some time. So I think that may be the parallel between the cinema and the historiography.
So there's a question from the chat room. The question is for Ben. James, would you like to read, or you would rather prefer me to read? I
Let
guess
me allow James to unmute himself, of course, because
okay.
Sorry about that. If you'd like to read out the question, it'd be great. I got up to the first half, but if you're more than welcome to.
Okay, James, if you want to read the question.
Yeah,
there
sure.
we go.
Hi. So yeah, so you focus quite heavily to the extent to which KCD is representing these historical positions and arguments in the kind of immersive way. But you did also sort of note some of the issues underlying that. So for example, there is this expanded role for the Cumans compared to what we get in the source material. And that does clearly tie into some things like the developers having a pretty explicitly Czech nationalist position on this period of history that's well on public record, and the extent to which the Cumans appear as kind of ethnicized villain figures in the game and in its promotional art and so on is one of the kind of social history issues with the game that has been raised a lot in these sorts of conferences and circles, and that kind of contrasts with this historical accuracy is paramount. We're using this as a framing for putting forward a historical argument side of it. So yeah, I guess I was wondering whether you could kind of bring in more of these sort of thoughts about curation of history and the ideological positions behind the game, and how does that fit into your kind of conceptualization of all this?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's been a long time, but I did some reading onto it. So that is part of my research. It's an interesting question. I think that question on nationalism, I would look at it in a much more nuanced way. There's a lot to unpack, of course, so I probably try and condense it down to the topic on Cumans. But I would just like to say that during my experience of the game, I wasn't just fighting Cumans. Another principal antagonist were Czech soldiers. And again, maybe, as part of the promotional art, they brought the Cumans in, but there were in other scenarios, albeit in a more smaller scale, there were other attacks on a couple of other villages that were committed by Czech soldiers, not just Cumans. So I think there's been that sort of heavily prevalent focus on, again, foreigners. But I think we've also got to look into it from the perspective of the character that you play. Something I've noticed in a lot of studies is that we don't really have a lot in historical game studies, as far as I know, with distinguishing the player avatar. So you, more or less, you as the embodiment in the game versus the player character. So you're playing as someone who's Henry, who's lived in Silver Skellets. Having gone through a horrific siege and massacre, I don't think from Henry's perspective in this history that he's going to look at the Cumans as sort of in a positive light. Another reason, of course, is Cumans fits one of those sort of enemies or bad guys. You have to have them in a story. It's a bit like Lord of the Rings, with the Shire, it's a great, nice setup, but if that was just it wouldn't probably be quite an interesting story the rest of the way. There has to be a conflict and ring wraiths to come in and cause the stir. So yeah, I do agree with you. I think the Cumans have been I would actually say they've probably portrayed in a more nuanced way. Obviously, as I said before, the Cumans obviously have attacked the village. So you come in from that perspective of, that these are antagonists and enemies. But the game, the Warhorse Studios do give you the option in certain cases when you fight Cumans. Some of them surrender, and you can have a choice, or several choices, between whether you want to spare them or kill them, or among other options. So they do try to give you that opportunity to, play on from your perspective of Henry. And from my perspective, I killed them, not because of the attacks and atrocities they committed. But yeah, just to go back to the general point, sorry, I think, as I said, I think that the question on nationalism in the game, I think has to be somewhat more nuanced. I felt they did a very good job at sort of not making out Czechs are the good guys, everyone outside of Czech is a bad guy. There were Czechs who were supporting Sigismund and Czechs who were supporting Wenceslaus, but they also made a very good job at even addressing those two kings to point out that neither of them were, pretty much both of them were pretty bad in the summary of it. Very melancholy, very prone to rage, and while Sigismund had more capabilities in military and diplomacy, his actions in the country did generate that infamy, which permeates today, his reputation because of the approaches he did in Bohemia. And again, the Cumans are hired mercenaries. They are professional fighters. So that's the other thing. But I should probably add as well, they do give them a very fair treatment insofar as their professionalism. So when I was in a mission, I was scavenging through the camp, and I noticed that the Cumans area, because they were occupied by Cumans and Czechs. This is in I think the ruined church of Protestants. And the Cumans were organized, clean, and tidy, and the Czechs had very unhygienic, dirty, filthy areas. And I felt it was just a really nice subtle tone to address that even though these are bad guys, they at least did give them a fair point that, they don't try to make them out as menacing or barbaric. And even just the language, I think there was an article I read that they're saying, oh, they call them Tartars. And he pointed out there was an inaccuracy, and I don't agree with that. I thought this was highlighting how common people perceiving actions of Cumanians bring up those stereotypes of the menacing horsemen and the riders. In contrast, when I talked to sort of more the knights or the lords, they call them Cumans. So they had more knowledge and education. They still pointed out their activities, but they were giving them a much more sort of a fair assumption opinion. So I think this is, I guess in the summary of it, I think, as I said, they pretty much made a pretty good job at sort of complicating the sort of the politics of Bohemia or Czech society at that time. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot to unpack, and I would really love to talk more about it because, I felt the game, there's a lot of hidden gems in the game, and I felt that unfortunately it got into less of an actual critical analysis and more of being sort of dragged between both sides of discourse and online media, But I'm really interested to hear people's thoughts or, hope that answers the question.
You will maybe have the opportunity to continue the conversation in the Topia space that we have between panels. Maybe we can take a few more minutes because we had some issues with some of the papers. So maybe for 2 more questions, and then that's it. Okay.
Yeah. So the next, the floor is
maybe let's do something.
Andrew.
Let's gather both questions right up front, and then we have the
Yeah.
answers. So first Andrew, and then James. Sounds good.
And Andrew was our keynote speaker in our very first conference. We are glad to have him. Please, Andrew.
Yes. Give me a moment. There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, just thank you all three. I know we're very short of time, so thank you all three for 3 wonderful papers. My question was sort of related to something that Ben said, but since it's probably about 1:30, I think, by my calculations in Waikato, I actually want to ask it to Madeline because I think it relates also to what you were saying. By the way, if that was your first paper, that was incredible. Congratulations. I still seek to be quite so eloquent. So my question, I suppose, is about using history through games as models, right? As a kind of the same way that we tend to use models to predict the future, the weather forecast and so on, use the simulations and models. And it was related to, what Ben was saying about thinking through the battles. And I wonder whether there was something about, first of all, approaching a game from an art history perspective. So you're seeing things that I would never in a million years see, the patterns in the floor, the pavements, the rich textural details and so on. And that wonderful King Crooks with a wonderful adjective that I'm going to try and use. But also, I wonder if there's an element that kind of embodied an experiential history that you're seeing through the games, and this is relating also to something that Olga Kalashnikova mentioned this morning. Does that allow for different ways of seeing history beyond the canon, beyond the kind of the usual? So again, that art history allows you to see history in a way that maybe might run against the canon. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I'll leave you to the next question as Evelyn asked.
James?
Yeah, thank you. And ditto the congratulations on your paper, Madeline. So the question I have for you, which is a sort of I guess a bit of a generic one, is with the kind of paper of the place you were presenting, it's a very specifically individualized location. Like it is super singular and unique in how it's placed, how it's presented, how the kind of landscape is built around it in a very almost ritualized way. So I guess I wanted to kind of ask you to broaden out a bit and say a bit about how much you think that uniqueness of place is necessary for getting some of these kind of art historical features to work well. Or like if you were imagining a situation or a game setup where you were like generating cities almost, can you still use some of these motifs, or are they very reliant on like this is Rome, this is Oribos? Like, do they actually rely on that singularity of place, or is there sort of more potential for kind of wider use of some of these things?
And we have one final question for Madeline, so maybe we can do all the three in just one go. So the final question from Hannah says, does the pseudo-Roman quincunx theme appear in any other realms of the Shadowlands or in the wider World of Warcraft realm? Or is it especially limited to Oribos itself? If it is limited to Oribos, are there any regional references in the rest of the Shadowlands that would relate to other real-world societies? So, yeah. So those are the various questions, so feel free to.
Okay, thank you, first of all, for complimenting my first paper. I've given presentations before, but not for an audience, so this was quite fun. I'm going to start with like the easiest question first and then move into the harder questions. Hopefully that will help tease out the information. So I'm going to go for Hannah's question first, being that is the quincunx limited to Oribos? The answer is yes. There are of the other four, or I guess five, if you include the more peripheral realms of the Shadowlands, they each have their own insignia that are kind of, political icons for that. And one of the main objectives of players from, either faction, once they enter the Shadowlands, is that they join a covenant that is associated with one of these four peripheral realms. And so then they kind of take on this idea. You do quests for this covenant, you gain reputation with this covenant, and you obtain items that kind of flaunt this this particular covenant's insignia. But there is no covenant for Oribos. It's just kind of it's this place that you always show up, you always end up being there. There are quest givers in Oribos that will give you things like, I think on my slideshow I had that that great axe that had a central quincunx in it that was quite lovely. You could receive that item after completing a quest, but you wouldn't get that from, like, let's say Revendreth. You wouldn't get that from one of the other regions. It's unique to Oribos, which means that like anything with this kind of insignia on it is either belonging to or made in Oribos, a kind of makership trademark, so sort of thing. So yes, it is limited. I haven't spent time looking at the other regions, although I can tell you that Revendreth is delicious because it is just dripping with 14th and 15th century Gothic architecture that is quite literally more Gothic. Like it's so dark, add vampires, like that kind of thing. But that's a whole other can of worms. And then I think I'm going to go to the question asking about plurality of place. I think, was that James's question? Can you very briefly reiterate your question for me as well? Maybe about
yes, yeah, sorry, I was just waiting to be invited to unmute.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess one of the things I was thinking about is the extent to which kind of Rome or Oribos are these like super specific locations, and for some of that imagery to work, they almost need to. It felt like maybe they almost need to be unique. And I guess because I work a lot with kind of looking at procedural generation of places and cities and so on in my game dev, that kind of got me thinking, how important is the kind of uniqueness of the place to the kind of functionality and of this sort of architectural imagery that you're discussing?
Okay, yeah, gotcha. So the developers kind of, I could feel that they were maybe in a bit of a predicament when trying to depict an ancient city of a fictional afterlife. What avenue do you go aesthetically? They've already used like typically ancient Roman or ancient Greek architecture for other pre-existing cultures in the video game. And so it would seem weird if they used it again, because then it contradicts with this other culture that already exists that isn't connected to the afterlife. It's totally different. So they were, I think, kind of pigeonholed to think like, okay, what can we do? What is the vibe? And the vibe is pilgrimage mausoleum, and it hadn't been done before. There are other rotunda-like structures, but they are definitely like, with fluted columns and Corinthian capitals, like very either Baroque or ancient Roman. So I think they were kind of looking for what other things have not been used. And so I think then this plays on the first question about, new canon through art history and, presenting niche histories in a new way that almost kind of, brings them to the forefront. I like to think about it as there's two types of history. There's history with a lowercase h, and there's history with a capital H. And they kind of took this history with a lowercase h and took it to maybe a capital H by putting it in a game that is just so widely visited. And so now, I mean, I'm the crazy pavement lady. You can ask any of my colleagues. I'm the person that's not looking up at the frescoes or the ceilings and none of that. No. I'm looking at the floors. And, once you maybe play the game, and then you happen to go into a church that has these, you're like, wait a minute, I've seen these before. And then you start to see like, oh, they've used something that's real. They aren't just making it all up. And it's not just fantasy and, it's totally reinvented. Like they are derived from real things. And with that in mind, like this original project was kind of just going to be a YouTube series because there's a lot of YouTube videos out there by people who play World of Warcraft that are interested in lore and lore history, which is of course very cool and interesting. But like I said, what's all that 20,000 years of lore without stuff to go with it, stuff to emphasize how the lore works. And so that was what I was going to bring to the table, but my YouTube series has not kicked off yet. I don't have the time, but yeah, I hope that answers these questions. Thank you so much for picking my brain.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Remember just that in case you want to continue the conversations, because I know that there are still probably many questions, we can use the Topia space between the panels. So again, feel free to continue the conversation over there. Evan, if you want to close the session, or you want to, I can do it. No, there you go. There you go.
Okay. So I think if we are done with that, yeah, I think it would be fair to close off. There were some more questions, but anyways, thank you very much for this really yet another exciting session, and we'll see you at 4 o'clock. And in the meantime, just take a deep breath, relax, have coffee. It was wonderful. Thank you very much again.